Hello again, Sean back with you. A little bit different today because I'm not sitting in front of the camera, I'm actually behind the camera as I show you some of what goes into making 18th century clothing as we do this behind the scenes thing for the Conakajig Institute. We're probably going to be doing something once a week to track the progress of what's going on. So today we are looking at the insides of coat panels. Now what you're looking at here, this is the coat panel that I talked about in our last video, that Nankeen coat that's being made. You'll notice that this coat panel is finished here. So you're looking at the inside. This is all of the lining this coat's going to get. It's what's called a facing here. And then the rest of it is just completely unlined. That's the inside of the fabric. As I mentioned, this is a summer coat, so to reduce the heat, you're going to put less fabric on the inside. The panel up here, though, this is an unfinished panel that'll go on the other side. This is the buttonhole side. You can see with the finished buttonholes when you look at it from the outside. And this is the panel that the buttons will actually go on. The buttons have not been put on yet. When they are put on, they will go here. But this is what it's going to look like on the inside in process. An interesting thing to note about 18th century clothing is that you're going to manufacture it as flat as possible. Despite the fact that the human body is curved and there's pretty much no flat spots at all, you're trying to keep all of the clothing as flat as possible while you're making it. So it's not really going to be assembled until you have all the pieces individually finished. So one of the big things that everyone notices when they first see it on in-process pieces is all of these stitches that go everywhere. These are called basting stitches, and that's to hold everything in place. The art of making clothing mostly comprises of inserting and pulling out basting stitches because they're going to show up everywhere. They're going to be in all of the layers on the inside here. They're going to be using to hold the lining in place. They're going to be used to hold all sorts of stuff in place. And at the very end, you're going to pull them all out. Or maybe you're not going to pull them all out. There are plenty of museum pieces of originals that still have basting stitches somewhere on the inside. They've even found a couple of pins inside some original clothing. So if you ever leave a pin inside of something, don't feel bad about it. They were doing it several hundred years ago. This layer of cloth that you see in here, this is what's called the interfacing. A lot of times it's also made out of, it's commonly referred to as buckram because that's a lot of times what the fabric is being called. Buckram most commonly is going to be some sort of heavy linen. The stuff that I have in here is a 10-ounce linen canvas. And then it's going to be stiffened with some sort of agent. The most common stuff that they're using in the 18th century is called gum tragacanth. It's kind of like xanthium gum, except more heavy duty. It's still used by people in food service industry to get some of those crazy cake things that where you need it to be stiff and you need to stay in place. It's kind of really heavy duty xanthium gum. The one thing about gum tragacanth and any other type of stiffening agent is that it is water soluble, which means if you sweat too much, if you get it soaked, you are going to dilute that and eventually it's going to come out, which is why you're using a very heavy duty cloth, because it's still going to give some sort of stiffness. The point of the interfacing is to give that stiff shape so that way you're not all wrinkly and you're not all lumpy. This cloth that's in here, it is not stiffened with gum tragacanth. A lot of buckram that's being used in the 18th century, they're just not stiffening it, simply because, like I just said, it's water soluble, so sometimes it's not in there, but a lot of times it is. This garment is made with the express purpose that it may be laundered at some point in time, which is why I haven't stiffened any of this linen at all in terms of the interfacing, because why am I going to stiffen it if the first time I washed it, it's just all going to come out? It's going to maintain enough of a form with it just as it is, so I'm not going to take that extra step. Inside of this layer, you'll see on this interfacing that it is reinforcing and actually causing the edge. This cloth that you see here, you can see that it's going to fray as it's being used. So as soon as you cut it, it starts to fray a little bit. So when you insert the interfacing, this edge is going to be tucked over and it's going to be whip stitched on the inside. So you can see that right here along the edge. You can see the little tiny layer of stitches. That's the stitching holding it all in place. So you're locking all that raw stuff on the inside, and then you're gonna sew it down so that way it doesn't go anywhere and it doesn't fray. On the other side of the interfacing, sorry, there's no iron adhesive interfacing in the 18th century. It's just going to be stitched with very small stitches that only go through a couple threads on the actual fabric itself. So when you turn it over, you're really not going to be able to see it that much. You can see one of the little tiny stitches right there, but that's really about it. As I said, this side is going to be the button side, and to reinforce the buttons so they don't fall off, and to give them a little bit of extra support so that side doesn't sag down as you're wearing it, you're going to create what's called a button stand. You can see this layer of decorative stitching right here. It's just an extra layer of interfacing that's placed on top of the existing one to give it a little bit of extra reinforcement. That's the button stand right there. It is sewn in on this side with that whip stitch, and on the other side there's this really tiny, delicate either prick stitching or a running stitch that goes along the edge that'll go the length of the buttons. So it ends where the buttons are going to end. You can see the end of it right there, and then it doesn't go any further. It serves its purpose, and then it's done. The other thing you're going to see from the inside is this layer of running stitches right here. That's to mark where the pocket's going to go eventually. The pocket flap will be on there, that side, and that's just to mark it. So that's pretty much what it looks like from the inside. Now, interfacing is not just used on coats, it's used on all sorts of other stuff. So to do that, we'll show you that. I'll bring up that pair of breeches I was working on last week. I'll show you that. Hasn't progressed too much, well, at least it doesn't look like it. But there'll be interfacing on breeches on the fall right here to give it more shape, to give it more reinforcement. It's also going to be up on the tops right here that are going to form pockets, so that way your pockets stay nice and stiff. Again, it's going to be folded over, it's going to be stitched in place. You notice the stitching isn't pretty. We have a lot of stitching on 18th century clothes that does look very nice. It's very small, it's very pretty, it's very precise. But on things like this, on interfacing that no one's ever going to see, that's just serving the purpose of tacking it in place, it doesn't really matter. So a lot of times it's not the greatest looking. But then when you get on the outside, you get, well, you can't really see it with the corduroy because the wales kind of just absorb all the stitching. But you will see really small, I'll show you here on this coat, you will see these very small, precise, even stitches that go along the edge. Most of the stitches I do are about 12 to 16 stitches per inch, and they are all done by hand. The last thing with the interfacing I want to show you, it's pretty interesting that we're doing with this particular one, is right here on the knees. So these are going to be right here on the knee, and there'll be a band right there. But it's going to close right here on this part, and there'll be 4 buttonholes that go along here to form the knee closure. And here's the interfacing for it. The interfacing here, it's not that stiff linen that you're seeing over here that I'm using. It's just a scrap piece of wool broadcloth. This is a detail that you see on a lot of 18th century original clothing. Instead of using a layer of buckram and then using a lining on top of that, some tailors will simply put a scrap of wool in there, and that'll serve as both the reinforcement and the lining. It's both a cost-saving measure and a time-saving measure, because as you have this scrap wool, you can use it for something. There are a couple of examples where the wool that's being used by the tailor is very bright and contrasts the color that they're using, which is why I've elected to put this nice red wool in here. So it'll look pretty great, and as it peeks out, maybe you'll catch a glimpse of it on these breeches, which will be fun. So anyway, that's where we are today, insides of stuff. Hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you learned a little something. We'll be back next week. I think we're going to be doing one of these per week. Thanks for watching.